The sight froze me where I stood. My Harley, my pride, my machine, my history, wasn't where I'd parked it in my driveway last night. Instead, there was just a dark oil stain on the pavement, a few crushed leaves blowing over the empty space. And then Karen's voice cut through the air, sweet as poison. "Oh, I took care of that eyesore for you. Sold it this morning. You'll thank me later." I could feel the blood pounding in my ears. Sold it? Without my permission? My Harley wasn't just some bike. It was custom-built, one of a kind, and worth more than most people's cars. It wasn't a hobby, it was a piece of me. But she kept talking, arms folded, a smug tilt to her head. It violated HOA policy. Non-compliant vehicles aren't allowed in driveways. I found a buyer and got rid of it. It's gone. You'll get a little check in the mail, but don't expect much. It wasn't worth much anyway. That was when the real weight of her mistake settled in. Karen didn't know who I was. She didn't know I was the senior vice president of operations at Harley-Davidson. She didn't know I had more influence in the motorcycle world than anyone she'd ever meet. And she had just set fire to the one line she should never have crossed. But I didn't tell her, not yet. The worst thing you can do to someone who thinks they're in control is let them believe it, just long enough to dig their own grave. I turned and walked back into my house, my hands shaking, not from fear, but from the fury I was holding back. And as I shut the door, I knew one thing: the HOA had just signed up for a lesson in consequences they'd never forget. Before all this, before the screaming neighbors and the looming federal trouble, I thought my life in this neighborhood would be peaceful. I had moved here 3 years ago, choosing a quiet cul-de-sac far from city noise. Back then, I was looking for something simple. A place to park my Harley after long rides, grill steaks on the weekend, and maybe wave at my neighbors without having to talk too much. The first time I saw Karen, she was already wearing that tight, sour look she's famous for. She introduced herself as the HOA president before she even told me her name. She handed me a packet of rules thicker than a phone book and said, "We run a tight ship here." I smiled politely, not realizing those words were less of a warning and more of a threat. For the first year, I kept my head down. I paid my dues. I kept my lawn trimmed exactly to the height limit. I didn't park in the street. I thought I had her figured out, just a small-time power tripper who liked to write strongly worded emails. Then came the first little storm, a letter about my American flag. According to her, my flagpole was too tall by HOA standards. I showed her the federal law protecting residential flags, and she backed down, but not before giving me that cold little smile. The kind people give when they're already planning the next move. And she didn't disappoint. A few weeks later, she claimed my Harley was an unregistered vehicle, because she didn't see a plate on it when it was covered. I sent her a photo of the plate, along with the registration, and thought that was the end of it. But Karen doesn't lose. At least, not in her mind. She just waits. By last month, the tension was boiling again. She complained that my bike was too loud when I left for rides on Saturday mornings. I pointed out that it was within legal decibel limits, and that was when her tone changed. She stopped sending letters. She stopped making small talk. She just watched. And I should have known that meant she was planning something bigger. That something came to life yesterday. I was out of town for 2 days, attending a Harley-Davidson board meeting in Milwaukee. My neighbor, Tom, texted me late on the first day. He said he saw 2 men loading my bike into a white pickup truck. When he asked what was going on, Karen herself stepped out of her car and said the HOA had authorized removal due to policy violations. She told him to mind his own business. By the time I got home, it was gone. I stood in my driveway staring at the oil stain, and I swear, for a second, it didn't feel real. That Harley was my late father's project. We'd rebuilt it together over 5 years, custom chrome, leather seat hand-stitched by a friend of his, engine tuned so perfectly it purred like a cat and roared like a lion. He'd passed it down to me when he got too old to ride, and it had been with me through every chapter of my adult life. Now it was sitting in some stranger's garage, or worse, already stripped for parts, because Karen decided she could play judge, jury, and executioner. I didn't yell at her. I didn't call the police right away. I just looked at her, let her think she'd won. And I said, "Karen, you just made the biggest mistake of your life." She laughed. That was her second mistake. Later that night, I sat in my office with the blinds closed. I opened my laptop and pulled up the Harley-Davidson dealer network database. I knew the serial number of my bike like I knew my own birthday. With a few keystrokes, I sent an alert to every authorized Harley-Davidson dealership in the country: flag this VIN. Hold the bike if it comes in. Contact corporate immediately. And then I made a few more calls. Not just to dealerships, but to friends. Friends in high places. Friends in law enforcement. Friends in media. Karen still thought this was about an HOA rule violation. She had no idea she had just crossed into the territory of grand theft, interstate commerce violations, and corporate retaliation on a scale she couldn't even imagine. The game had just begun. And that's when my phone buzzed again, another text from Tom. "You're gonna want to see this. The guy who bought your Harley just showed up at Karen's house." I grabbed my jacket. Whatever was about to happen next, I wanted to see it with my own eyes. By the time I stepped outside, the sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the street. Karen was standing in her driveway, arms crossed like a general about to command troops. In front of her, parked crookedly on the curb, was a black Ford F-150 with a flatbed trailer hitched to the back. And there it was. My Harley. Only it wasn't the same Harley I remembered from 2 days ago. The bike was scratched, a dent along the side of the tank, and one of the mirrors hung limply like it had been hit. My heart sank, then hardened. A tall man in grease-stained jeans was pacing beside the truck, waving his arms. "You didn't tell me this was stolen property," he yelled. His voice carried across the whole cul-de-sac. Karen's voice stayed calm, smug even. "It's not stolen. The HOA authorized the sale." "That man," she said, jerking her chin toward my house, "was breaking neighborhood rules." I stepped forward, slow and deliberate. "Funny," I said, "because I have the title in my name. And a police report ready to file. You want to explain that to the nice gentleman here?" The buyer stopped pacing and looked at me. "You're the owner?" "Born and raised," I said. "And if you want to avoid a felony charge, I'd suggest you unstrap my bike right now." Karen rolled her eyes. "Oh, please. You're bluffing. The HOA has the authority." "No," I cut in, "the HOA has guidelines, not criminal jurisdiction. And you, Karen, just committed theft by conversion." The man looked between us, clearly realizing he'd been dropped into a mess he didn't want any part of. Without another word, he started unfastening the straps on the trailer. My Harley rolled down the ramp with a dull clunk as it hit the driveway. I bent down, running my hand along the scratched chrome. Every mark on it felt like a personal insult. But as furious as I was, I saw something in the man's face, genuine frustration. Not at me, but at her. "Lady," he said to Karen, "I drove 4 hours to pick this up. Paid you cash. You said you had the right to sell it." Karen crossed her arms tighter. "You'll get your money back. Eventually." That was the moment I decided to say something I hadn't planned on. "How much did she charge you?" $8,000, he said. I nearly laughed. 8,000 for a bike worth close to 70. And she'd probably pocketed every dollar. "You'll get your money back," I told him, but not from her. I'll make sure of it. You were lied to. And unlike her, I'm not in the business of ruining decent people's lives. His eyebrows rose, but he nodded slowly. I appreciate that. He got back in his truck, muttering something under his breath about never trusting HOAs again, and drove away. Karen didn't move. Her lips were pressed so thin they were almost gone. You think you're a hero, she said coldly. No, I said, I think I'm a man who just got his property back. But you? You just earned yourself a front row seat to the kind of trouble money can't buy your way out of. She didn't answer. Just turned and walked into her house without another word. That night, I wheeled my Harley into the garage, locked the door, and sat staring at it under the dim overhead light. The scratches hurt, but I could fix those. What stuck with me was the thought of how close I'd come to losing it forever. I also thought about the buyer. He'd been a victim, too, even if he'd been a little too eager to trust a stranger. There was a lesson in that, about not assuming the worst in people, and about offering help where you can. My father used to say, kindness is the strongest weapon you've got. It disarms faster than anger ever could. I decided I'd call the guy tomorrow, make good on my promise, and maybe invite him out for a ride someday once the Harley was back in shape. But that plan got interrupted before I even went to bed. At 11:42 p.m., I got an email from one of my contacts in Harley-Davidson corporate security. It was marked urgent. The subject line read, Possible interstate fraud, HOA president name flagged. Inside was a brief message, we traced similar unauthorized sales linked to the same individual in 2 other states. Law enforcement may be opening a federal investigation. Call me ASAP. And just like that, the scope of this mess got a whole lot bigger. I barely slept that night. The glow from my phone lit up the dark room as I stared at that email again and again, my mind turning over every possible angle. This wasn't just about my Harley anymore. If Karen was tied to other sales in other states, that meant she'd been doing this for a while, and not just here. At 6 a.m., I called my contact, Rob. He was one of those guys who didn't waste words. You're not gonna like this, he said as soon as he picked up. Try me. She's on record as the HOA president for 3 different communities in the past 6 years. In each one, there were complaints of property removals, boats, cars, motorcycles, sold under questionable authority. Most victims didn't have the time or money to fight back. She's a predator, plain and simple. My grip on the phone tightened. And law enforcement? 2 states already have open cases. Thing is, most of these complaints never made it past the local level. But now that we've got interstate activity, he let the sentence hang, but I knew exactly what it meant. Federal jurisdiction. I paced the kitchen, running a hand over my jaw. All right. Send me everything you've got. I'll handle the rest on my end. Careful, Rob warned. If she catches wind that the feds are circling, she might make a run for it. She won't, I said. Not until she thinks she's untouchable. After hanging up, I grabbed my coffee and stepped out onto the porch. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of calm that felt fake, like a stage set before the actors walk in. Karen's blinds were drawn, but I could feel her presence behind them. Watching. The day went on like any other. I went into work at Harley-Davidson's local branch, met with a few department heads, handled emails. But underneath it all, I was strategizing. Not for revenge, not yet, but for justice. My father always said, you can't ride smooth on a bent frame. Fix the structure first, then deal with the scratches. Late afternoon, I got a call from Tom. You're not gonna believe this, he said. Karen's walking around telling everyone you threatened her. I sighed. Of course she is. She says she's talking to the HOA board about disciplinary action against you. Whatever that means. I thanked him and hung up, shaking my head. Karen's playbook was as predictable as it was desperate: attack the other person's reputation before they can defend themselves. But she didn't know she'd stepped into an arena where I had far more reach than she did. Still, I knew I couldn't get sloppy. If I came at her too directly, she'd spin it into harassment. So, I decided to take a slower route. That night, I reached out to a couple of Harley dealers in the other states Rob mentioned. They confirmed they'd seen similar cases: vehicles removed from driveways, then sold under the guise of HOA policy. Every single one tied back to a Karen-type figure. But this wasn't just about her greed, it was about control. She liked the power of deciding what people could or couldn't keep. I started drafting a file: dates, addresses, names, VINs. By the time I was done, I had a 20-page document. It wasn't just evidence. It was a case. I was about to email it to Rob when a loud knock hit my door. 3 hard, rapid bangs. I stood, heart thudding, and opened it. Karen was on my porch, flanked by 2 men in cheap suits with clipboards. She didn't bother with a greeting. "You have been served," she said, holding out a packet of papers. One of the men stepped forward, smirking slightly, and handed me an official-looking notice. HOA disciplinary summons. Accusations of threatening behavior, property disputes, and community disruption. I glanced at Karen. She was smiling now, the same thin smile from the flagpole incident, but colder. "You think you can scare me," she said, "but I'm always 2 steps ahead." I leaned in just enough for her to hear me clearly. "Karen," I said, "you're standing in front of the wrong man, on the wrong porch, with the wrong papers." She blinked, her smile faltering for just a second. And then, before I could say another word, headlights swept across the street. A black SUV pulled up and parked right behind her. Out stepped 2 federal agents. The moment those agents stepped out, the entire air on the street changed. Even the cicadas seemed to go quiet. Karen turned, her confidence flickering like a candle in a draft. The taller agent approached first, badge in one hand, the other resting casually near his belt. "Karen Whitmore?" he asked in a voice that carried more authority than volume. Karen straightened her posture, trying to regain her composure. "Yes." "And you are?" "Special Agent Miller, Federal Bureau of Investigation." "This is Agent Ruiz." He nodded toward the second agent, a woman who was already pulling a small notepad from her jacket. "We'd like to speak with you about some property transactions across state lines." Karen gave a forced laugh. "This must be a mistake. I'm the president of our HOA. Everything I do is in accordance with policy." Miller's eyes didn't waver. "Ma'am, we'll discuss it in detail down at our field office. You can come voluntarily, or we can take you into custody right now. Your choice." For the first time since I'd met her, Karen didn't have a comeback. She just stood there, her lips parting, eyes darting from the agents to me and back again. I kept my face neutral, though inside, I could feel the surge of vindication rising. Not joy, this wasn't about petty satisfaction. It was about the fact that people like her finally faced consequences when they thought they were above the rules. One of the clipboard guys, apparently not with the agents, spoke up nervously. We'll leave," he mumbled, handing the packet of HOA papers back to Karen like it was radioactive. They walked off quickly, muttering to each other as they disappeared down the street. Karen finally found her voice. "I'm not going anywhere until I speak to my lawyer." Agent Ruiz stepped forward. "That's fine. You can call from the car." When they started guiding her toward the SUV, Karen twisted her head to glare at me over her shoulder. "This isn't over," she spat. I didn't answer. I just closed my front door and locked it. Inside, I sat down at my kitchen table and let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I should have felt relieved, but instead there was this quiet heaviness in my chest. I thought of all the people she'd hurt before me, families who didn't have the means to fight back, people who probably gave up hope when the system seemed too complicated or expensive to navigate. That was when I made a decision. This wouldn't just end with her. I was going to make sure her entire scheme unraveled, and that no other HOA board could hide behind fake policy to commit outright theft. The next morning, I met with Rob at a diner just outside the city. I slid the 20-page file across the table, along with a USB drive. Everything I've gathered is on there. VIN numbers, dates, even witness statements from 2 of the states she worked in before. Rob looked it over, his coffee steaming in front of him. "This is solid," he said. "The DOJ's going to want this. You sure you want to hand it off? Once they take it, it's their show." "I'm sure," I said. "But I'm not stepping away entirely. I've got another angle to work on." He raised an eyebrow. "Which is?" "Making sure every single HOA in this state gets a policy rewrite that shuts down this kind of loophole for good." Rob grinned. "Now that is going to make you unpopular in certain circles." I smiled faintly. "I've been unpopular before." We left the diner with a plan. He'd push the evidence up the chain. I'd start pulling strings with contacts in the state legislature and Harley-Davidson's own legal network to draft new homeowner protection measures. It was all falling into place, until that afternoon, when I came home to find my garage door wide open. The Harley was gone. Again. For a moment, I just stood there in the driveway, staring at the yawning darkness of my garage. My stomach dropped. This couldn't be happening again. The security camera by the front door was still blinking red, so I yanked out my phone and pulled up the live feed. My hands clenched when I saw the grainy footage. 2 masked figures had rolled my Harley out less than 30 minutes ago. They moved quick, practiced. And then I caught a detail that made my skin crawl. One of them was wearing an HOA security vest. It didn't make sense. Karen was in federal custody, so who else in the HOA was involved? I didn't waste time calling the local cops, I called Rob. "It's gone again," I said flatly. "Gone? As in stolen?" "As in taken out of my garage by someone wearing an HOA vest. 30 minutes ago." "Send me the footage," he said immediately. "Don't move it to the cloud. I'll get it straight to the task force." I sent it over, then grabbed my truck keys. Sitting around wasn't an option. If they were on the road, I might still have a chance of finding them before the bike disappeared for good. I took the back roads, scanning for any trailer or pickup that could carry a Harley. The first 20 minutes were nothing but empty asphalt and a growing knot in my chest. But just when I was about to turn back, I spotted a white box truck pulled off behind a closed gas station. I slowed, watching from a distance. 2 men were standing at the back, the door halfway open. I couldn't see inside, but I caught the glint of chrome under the dim security light. My bike. I parked out of sight, took a deep breath, and walked toward them. "Evening," I said casually. Both men froze. One of them reached for something inside his jacket, but I lifted my phone and angled it toward them. "Already streaming live to corporate security," I lied. "Every dealership in the state will know what you look like in 5 minutes." The taller one scowled. "We don't want trouble." "Too late for that," I said. "Roll it out. Now." They exchanged a look, then reluctantly backed away from the truck. I stepped forward, eyes locked on the Harley. It looked the same as when I'd last seen it, still scratched from the first theft, but otherwise untouched. One of them muttered, "We were just told to move it to a storage unit until the deal was sorted." I took a step closer. "Who told you that?" They didn't answer, but the twitch in their expressions told me they were lying by omission. Someone higher up was still pulling strings. I wheeled the bike down the ramp myself, every movement deliberate, my jaw tight. If you're smart, I told them, you'll forget you ever saw this motorcycle. And me. They didn't argue. They got in the truck and drove off into the night. Back at home, I locked the Harley inside the garage, then added 2 more padlocks and a heavy steel chain around the wheel. I even parked my truck tight against the door. I was exhausted, but my mind wouldn't stop. This wasn't just a crime of opportunity anymore, it was organized. Karen might have been the face of it, but clearly she wasn't acting alone. The next morning, I met with Tom in his backyard. He handed me a cup of coffee and lowered his voice. You didn't hear it from me, but there's been talk at the last HOA meeting, something about a storage deal for seized property. They've been selling stuff off the books for years. I felt that old heat rising in my chest. How many people on the board know? Tom shook his head. Enough to make it hard to pin on just one person. That was when my phone buzzed with a text from Rob, "Call me now. You need to hear this." I stepped away and dialed. They moved Karen, Rob said without preamble. She's out on bail. And get this, she's already requested an emergency HOA board meeting tonight. The second Rob said it, my pulse spiked. Out on bail? Calling an emergency meeting the same day my Harley got stolen again? That wasn't a coincidence, that was a declaration of war. By 6:45 p.m., I was walking into the HOA's cramped meeting hall. The air was thick with perfume, coffee, and barely concealed hostility. Karen was at the head of the long table, flanked by 5 board members. She looked tired but defiant, her posture radiating the kind of arrogance only someone who still thought they could bluff their way out of anything could carry. Well, she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. The man of the hour. Everyone, this is the gentleman who's been making quite the fuss over one motorcycle. A few board members chuckled, but others shifted uncomfortably. I didn't sit down. This isn't about one motorcycle, I said. It's about an organized theft ring you've been running under the cover of HOA policy. Karen smirked. You have no proof. That was my cue. I reached into my jacket and pulled out a manila folder so thick it bent under its own weight. This, I said, dropping it onto the table, is a compiled record of every fraudulent property seizure tied to you and your allies, boats, cars, motorcycles, from 3 states. Every victim. Every transaction. And it's already been sent to the FBI, the DOJ, and the State Attorney General. Her smirk faltered, but she kept her chin high. You're bluffing. No, I said, pulling out my phone and pressing play on a recording. The tinny audio filled the room, Tom's voice, crystal clear, describing the storage deal and off-the-book sales. Then the buyer from my Harley incident, explaining how Karen had assured him she had the authority to sell. And finally, the grainy but unmistakable voice of one of the masked men from last night saying they were told to move it until the deal was sorted. The room went dead silent. Karen's face turned a deep shade of red. You set me up. No, I said, stepping closer. You set yourself up. I just gave you the rope. Before she could respond, the doors swung open. 2 uniformed sheriff's deputies and Agent Miller from the FBI strode in. Karen Whitmore, Miller said, you're under arrest for interstate fraud, grand theft, and conspiracy to commit larceny. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the board. Karen shot to her feet, pointing at me. This is harassment. He's using his job to. Miller cut her off. Save it for court. They cuffed her right there at the head of her own table, the room buzzing with whispers. One board member leaned toward me and muttered, "Guess we'll be needing a new president." As they walked her out, Karen twisted in the doorway, her voice sharp and venomous. This isn't over. But I knew it was. In the days that followed, the HOA board dissolved under the weight of the investigation. several members resigned. New leadership stepped in, vowing to rebuild trust in the community. The storage deal operation unraveled completely, with property being returned to owners as far away as Georgia and Texas. My Harley stayed in my garage, this time under the watch of a brand new security system I had installed personally. Every scratch from its ordeals, I left untouched, a reminder that even the strongest steel can be scarred, but it can still ride. The buyer I'd met that first night came by one Saturday. I handed him an envelope with the full refund he'd lost to Karen. A promise is a promise, I told him. We ended up riding together that afternoon, two strangers turned friends by a mess neither of us had asked for. The sun was setting as we rolled down the highway, the wind cutting through all the tension of the past weeks. And I thought about my dad's words, about kindness being the strongest weapon. He was right. Because in the end, I didn't just get my bike back. I got justice, I got my community back, and I made sure Karen's game was finished for good. But most importantly, I proved something to myself: no matter how loud someone tries to roar over you, if you stand firm, keep your head clear, and fight with both brains and heart, you can ride through any storm.